It was late 2015, and I'd been working as an instructor for a therapeutic wilderness program in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The job was demanding, and shifts lasted 16 days straight, on call 24/7, with every moment spent deep in the wilderness. My role was to guide and supervise groups of at-risk teens, helping them navigate not just the trails, but also their lives. Most of my time was spent in areas like Cherokee National Forest and the edges of the Appalachian Trail, with each expedition taking us farther into the untamed wild. This wasn't just camping. It was a constant exercise in vigilance. Many of the kids were flight risks, so we had systems in place to prevent them from bolting into the woods. At night, the staff slept under open tarps between the kids' tents, and we had something called the boot line. The kids had to leave their boots under a gear tarp, visible from where we slept. If anyone tried to make a break for it, they'd be in Crocs or socks, not ideal for running through rugged terrain. One particular expedition took us to a spot we called Eagle's Hollow. It was remote even by our standards. The only way in or out was a narrow, overgrown trail, and the nearest town was over 15 miles away. I remember thinking it felt different from the other locations, quieter, heavier, like the air carried some kind of weight I couldn't explain. It was the kind of place where your instincts stayed sharp without you even realizing it. The hillbilly in the boots one night, about 5 days into the trip, I woke from my usual head count. It was my turn to check at 3 a.m., and I rolled out of my sleeping bag, careful not to wake my co-instructor. Using the red light on my headlamp to avoid startling the kids, I scanned the boot line first, as I always did. Something didn't feel right. There were more boots than there should have been. I blinked, thinking I was groggy from sleep. 13 pairs of boots lined up neatly under the tarp. But we only had 12 kids. My own boots were beside me, and my co-instructors were under her tarp. At the far end of the boot line, there was an unfamiliar pair of tall, battered hunting boots. My stomach twisted as the realization sank in. Someone else was here. Someone had been standing there, close enough to touch the kids' boots. I switched my headlamp to white light and aimed it toward the boots. That's when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the camp, his face hidden in the shadows, but his boots unmistakable. The moment the light hit him, he turned and walked silently into the woods. Not a word, not a sound, just a calm retreat into the darkness. I scrambled out of my bag, heart pounding, but by the time I reached the spot where he'd been, he was long gone. There was no trail, no broken branches, just the heavy silence of the forest. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with my knife in hand, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, as we packed up camp, 3 men walked out of the woods. They weren't on the trail. They came from a direction that didn't make sense. All 3 were armed, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. I immediately recognized the boots on one of them, the same pair I'd seen the night before. They didn't say a word, just stopped and stared at us from the edge of the clearing. I felt the kids freeze behind me, their nervous energy palpable. I stayed calm, moving slowly and deliberately as I folded my map. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching us in silence, before turning and disappearing into the trees. That night, we made camp several miles away, but I couldn't shake the unease. Around 2 a.m., a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. It was my co-instructor. She was clawing at her hair, sobbing uncontrollably. When I finally got her calm enough to speak, she told me she'd woken up to someone running their fingers through her hair. She turned on her headlamp to see a man's face inches from hers, wearing night vision goggles. He'd been braiding her hair. She quit the job the moment we got back to base camp. Surrounded in the pines several months later, I was leading another group, this time in a section of Cherokee National Forest called Raven's Hollow. It was an area known for its dense pine forests and steep, rocky terrain. The trees were so thick that even in daylight, The ground was shadowed and cold. At night, it felt like the forest was alive, the creak of branches and rustle of leaves amplified by the oppressive darkness. We'd set up camp near a stream, with the tents arranged in a semicircle around the fire pit. Around 9 p.m., we gathered for our nightly meeting. The kids were quiet, clearly tired after a long day of hiking. As I spoke, a loud crash echoed through the woods, coming from the direction of our bear hang. We all froze. The bear hang was a rope system we used to suspend food bags high in the trees, out of reach of animals. The crash meant the bags had fallen, or something had taken them down. I grabbed my flashlight, and we headed over to investigate. Sure enough, the bags were on the ground, but there were no signs of animals. The rope hadn't snapped. It had been untied. I grumbled at the kids for their shoddy not tying and helped them rehang the bags. But an hour later, the same thing happened. This time, I tied the knot myself, making sure it was secure. As we walked back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods felt too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, the fire went out. Not gradually, like it would if it had burned down, but all at once, as if someone had dumped water on it. The camp plunged into darkness, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling us. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the pine needles. Branches snapped all around us, the cracks echoing through the trees. The kids huddled in their tents, whispering nervously, while my co-instructor and I stood by the fire pit, gripping our knives. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they surrounded the camp completely. But no matter where I shone my flashlight, I couldn't see anyone. The noise continued for hours, footsteps, snapping branches, the occasional low rustle of leaves. When dawn finally broke, we found broken branches scattered around the perimeter of the camp. Hanging from the rope where our food had been was a charred baby doll, its face blackened and melted. We packed up and left immediately, cutting the trip short. None of us spoke much during the hike out, but I could see the fear in the kids' eyes. They knew as well as I did that whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't just messing around. The woods don't forget, and neither do I. Camping had always been a family tradition. Every summer, no matter how busy things got, my mom insisted we pack up and head out to a campground somewhere. The year it all happened, I was 11. It was the last summer my mom took us camping, though at the time, none of us realized it would be. We were at a small campground in Missouri, tucked into the edge of a forest near some wide, open plains. It was early August, one of those sweltering months where the air felt heavy, and storms often rolled in without much warning. We had brought along the old truck camper, instead of leaving it in the truck bed, though my mom had unlatched it and set it up on its thin metal legs, letting it stand freely on the gravel campsite. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, boxy space with a bed, a little dinette, and a tiny kitchenette. It was barely big enough for the three of us. My mom, my sister Emily, and me. Emily was only 8, still young enough to find wonder in the simplest things. She loved camping. The campground was lively that week. Several other families were spread out across the campsites. There was a troop of Girl Scouts camping in tents not far from us, their laughter carrying through the woods as they played games and roasted marshmallows. Nearby, a couple of retirees had parked their sleek RV. Everything felt safe and familiar, the way it always did when we went camping. The first 2 nights were uneventful. We spent our days hiking short trails, wading in a nearby creek, and sitting by the campfire as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. The weather was warm, a little humid, but nothing unusual. It wasn't until the 3rd night that everything changed. It started with the wind. I woke up to a strange feeling, like the camper was shifting ever so slightly. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. I sat up in bed, the thin curtain that separated my bunk from the main area barely swaying. My mom was awake, sitting upright on her bed. She wasn't moving, just staring at the small window next to her. Her face was tense. Her eyes narrowed in a way I'd never seen before, the kind of look that made my stomach drop. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching her as I tried to figure out what was going on. The wind outside had picked up, its low howl growing louder with each passing second. The camper creaked. I felt the metal legs beneath us tremble, just slightly, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through me. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds outside. The wind had a strange, rhythmic quality to it, like a low, distant rumble. It reminded me of a train, the way it built up, steady and relentless. That's when it clicked. We were in tornado country. I'd heard stories about storms out here, how they could come out of nowhere and rip through everything in their path. The thought made my chest tighten. The camper rocked again, this time more noticeably. I gripped the edge of my bed, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the storm. Emily was still asleep, curled up under a pile of blankets, blissfully unaware of the chaos outside. I don't know how long we sat like that, listening to the wind scream and howl around us. The sound of the train grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of us. The camper shook violently, the thin walls groaning as the wind slammed into them. I thought for sure the metal legs were going to give out, that the whole thing would topple over and crush us. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the worst of it passed. The wind died down, leaving behind an eerie, deafening silence. For a few seconds, none of us moved. I didn't even dare to breathe. My mom finally exhaled, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. The camper creaked again, but this time, it was just the sound of it settling back into place. When we finally stepped outside, the campground looked like a war zone. Branches and debris were scattered everywhere, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. A couple of smaller trailers had been knocked onto their sides, their windows shattered. The Girl Scouts campsite was in shambles. Their tents had been lifted clean off the ground and dropped back down in collapsed heaps. I could see them huddled together near the campground bathrooms, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light against the concrete walls. As it turned out, they'd spent the rest of the night in that bathroom, all of them crammed into the stalls and showers, waiting for the storm to pass. They were shaken up but unharmed. One of the scout leaders told my mom later that the tornado had touched down just a few miles from the campground. It hadn't been a direct hit, but it was close enough to cause all that damage. We stayed one more night, but it wasn't the same. The air felt different, heavy with the knowledge of how close we'd come to disaster. I remember lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the camper. I kept thinking about how fragile it all was. The thin walls, the spindly metal legs holding us up, the way the wind could have easily swept us away. We never went camping again after that. My mom didn't say it outright, but I think the storm had shaken her more than she let on. For years, I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the sound of the wind and the way it felt to sit there, powerless, waiting for something terrible to happen. Even now, every time I hear the distant rumble of a train, I can't help but remember that storm and the way it made the world feel so small and fragile. I agreed to go camping with my ex-wife and her grandma because I thought it might help ease some of the tension between us. Her grandma was the one who pushed for it, saying we could all use some fresh air. The plan was simple, a quiet weekend at a campsite far from everything. I wasn't sure how relaxing it would be, but I went along with it. The drive was quiet and uneventful. As we got closer, the road turned into a bumpy dirt path. Eventually, we parked and carried our gear the rest of the way. The spot her grandma picked was deep in the woods, far from any other campers. It was peaceful, I'll admit. Tall trees surrounded us, their tops swaying in the breeze. The air smelled fresh, mixed with the scent of damp dirt and plants. The only sounds were birds and the occasional crunch of leaves when the wind blew. We set up camp near a small stream. We put up 2 tents and made a fire pit. Her grandma had more energy than I expected for her age. She wandered around, gathering plants and herbs, leaving the heavy lifting to me and my ex. By the time the sun set, everything was ready. The fire crackled, and a pot of stew simmered over it. When the sky went dark, the woods got louder. Crickets chirped nonstop, an owl hooted nearby, and somewhere far off, I heard coyotes. Put me on edge, though I didn't want to admit it. We sat by the fire in silence, lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, we all went to our tents. Her grandma had her own, and I shared one with my ex-wife. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. A faint snap, like a stick breaking. It was close, maybe just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. A few seconds later, I heard the crunch of leaves, slow and steady, then nothing. I glanced at my ex-wife. She was still asleep. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked outside. The moonlight wasn't very bright, but I could see the trees and the campfire, which had burned down to glowing embers. Everything looked normal. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out, my boots crunching softly on the dirt. I scanned the campsite, shining the light between the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. But when I checked her grandma's tent, it was empty. Her sleeping bag was tossed aside, and her boots were gone. My chest tightened. I called her name in a low voice, but there was no reply. Then I heard it again, the crunching sound, this time further away, heading deeper into the woods. I quickly put on my boots and jacket, deciding not to wake my ex. I followed the sound, keeping my flashlight low to avoid startling her if she was wandering. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The crickets and owls stopped, and the air felt heavier. After what felt like forever, I saw her. She was standing in a clearing, facing away from me, staring at something on the ground. Her figure looked strange, almost too still. I called her name again, louder this time, but she didn't react. As I got closer, the smell hit me, rotten and metallic. I gagged but kept walking. Then I saw what she was looking at. A pile of dead animals. Squirrels, rabbits, even a deer. They were all laid out in a perfect circle, their bodies stiff and twisted in unnatural ways. Her grandma didn't move. Her arms hung at her sides, and her head tilted slightly, like she was trying to listen to something. I hesitated, but I reached out and touched her shoulder. The moment my hand brushed her jacket, she turned around so fast it made me jump. Her eyes were wide, and her face looked terrified, but also blank, like she wasn't fully there. Her mouth moved like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, she turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I stood there frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I wanted to chase her, but something about that circle of animals made me feel like I wasn't supposed to stay there. I turned and ran back to camp. I woke my ex-wife and told her we had to leave. We didn't argue or pack properly. We just grabbed what we could and left the rest behind. As I drove down the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel, the headlights caught something at the edge of the forest. It was her grandma, standing barefoot on the side of the road, staring at the car as we passed. Her face was blank, and her eyes didn't blink. 2 days later, search teams found her miles away from the campsite. She was confused and couldn't explain what had happened or how she got there. She didn't remember the circle of animals or the clearing. But I remember. I can still see it every time I close my eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of crunching leaves outside my window, slow and steady, like something is still out there, waiting. The rain started just after it got dark, first as a light drizzle, but soon turning heavier. I had set up my camp on a flat area halfway up a mountain in the forest. Getting there hadn't been easy. The trail was steep, and my pack felt heavier with every step. But the view of the trees stretching out below made it worth it. I'd put my tent near some big rocks, hoping they'd block some of the wind. My plan was simple: spend one night, then head back down in the morning. As the rain grew heavier, the sounds of the forest became sharper. Raindrops hit the leaves and ground, blending into a steady noise. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of bushes nearby. I told myself it was just animals, probably deer or raccoons looking for a dry spot like me, but something about it felt wrong. The noises didn't sound random. They were too steady, too close. It was like something or someone was moving around my camp on purpose. The rain made it hard to hear much else, but at one point, I thought I caught the sound of a crunch, like a heavy step on wet gravel. I froze. My heart raced as I listened as hard as I could. My headlamp was still on, so I grabbed it and pointed it outside the tent. The beam cut through the rain, lighting up the trees and wet ground. I didn't see anything, just dripping branches and wet rocks. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me because I was alone. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I zipped the tent flap up tighter and sat there, knife in hand, feeling ridiculous but unable to put it down. The thin tent walls made me feel safer, though I knew they wouldn't stop anything. I tried to focus on the rain, using it to drown out my thoughts. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't faint. Something heavy moved through the wet bushes near the rocks. My breath hitched, and I sat up, clutching the knife so hard my hand hurt. I turned my headlamp back on, and it flickered before finally staying lit. Slowly, I aimed the light outside, moving it inch by inch. Then I saw it. Someone was crouched just past the rocks. They were big, their body dark and hard to make out in the rain, but it was clearly a person. They didn't move. They just crouched there, staring at my tent. I couldn't see their face, and they didn't make a sound. They were just there. My chest tightened, and my blood went cold. I didn't know what to do. My thoughts were racing. If I yelled, would they go away? Or would that make them come closer? What if they had a weapon? I sat frozen, gripping my knife, trying to steady my breathing but failing miserably. Then, as slowly as they had appeared, they started moving backward. Step by step, they melted into the shadows of the trees until I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out the rain. I waited for what felt like hours, every small sound making me flinch, but they didn't come back. When the sky finally started to brighten, I didn't waste a second. I packed everything as quickly as I could, skipping breakfast and barely checking my gear. The rain hadn't let up, and the trail was slippery and dangerous, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. Every snap of a branch or rustle of a leaf made me whip my head around, expecting to see them again. But I didn't. By the time I got to the parking lot, I was soaked to the bone and shaking from more than just the cold. I threw my pack into the car and fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside. That's when I saw it. On the driver's side window, smeared in the rain and mud, was a handprint. It was huge, far bigger than mine. I stared at it, feeling my stomach drop. My car had been parked here the whole time. Whoever it was had been here long before I came back. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove down the empty forest road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road stayed empty. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that handprint or how long they might have been watching me before I ever saw them. And the worst part? A week later, I read about a hiker who went missing in that same area. They found his gear, but they never found him. I agreed to go camping with my boss, Mike, because he said it would be a nice way to relax and get to know each other better outside of work. Mike loved the outdoors and was always talking about hiking and camping. I wasn't really into that stuff, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to try something new for a weekend. We drove a few hours out of town to a spot Mike had been to before. It was deep in the woods, far from other campers or marked trails. Mike said he liked being away from people, and this place definitely delivered on that. It was just us, the thick trees, and the endless quiet. The smell of pine and dirt was strong, and the silence almost felt unnatural after being surrounded by the usual city noise. Mike set up the tent while I collected some wood for a fire. Felt calm at first. The sun started going down, and the shadows from the trees stretched across the ground. It got cold fast, and by the time we had a fire going, it was already dark. We sat there eating and listening to random noises from the bushes, probably animals moving around. Around midnight, I decided I'd had enough for the day. Mike said he was going to stay up a bit longer by the fire. I climbed into the tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to fall asleep. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, the wind rustling the leaves, and far-off howls that I told myself were coyotes. It made me uneasy, but I figured this was normal for camping. At some point, I woke up. There was a noise outside the tent, something close. I thought it was Mike coming in, but when I called his name, nothing happened. I waited, but he didn't answer. I unzipped the tent a little and peeked out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Mike's chair was empty. His gear was still there by the fire, but he was nowhere to be seen. I assumed he had wandered off for some reason, maybe to use the bathroom, so I waited. But as the minutes passed and he didn't come back, I started to feel nervous. Mike wasn't the type to just disappear. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. I called his name again, shining the light around the campsite. The forest felt different, heavier, almost like it was closing in on me. There was no answer, just the same sounds of the night. I walked around a bit, looking for him, but found nothing. Then I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. They led away from the campsite. The prints weren't normal. They looked uneven, like he'd been running or stumbling. My stomach tightened, but I followed them, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The tracks led deeper into the woods, far from the tent and the fire. The deeper I went, the more my gut told me to turn around, but I kept going. After what felt like forever, I saw something on the ground ahead. My chest tightened. As I got closer, I realized it was Mike's jacket, just lying there. The footprints stopped right there, as if he had just disappeared into thin air. There were no drag marks, no other tracks, nothing. I grabbed the jacket, my hands shaking, and turned back. The walk to the campsite felt much longer than it should have. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every sound made me jump. By the time I got back, I was drenched in sweat, even though the air was freezing. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there holding my flashlight like it was a weapon. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I packed my stuff as fast as I could and left. I reported Mike missing as soon as I got back to town. The police organized a search, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of him. It was like he had been swallowed up by the forest. A few weeks later, I tried to move on, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Then, one of my coworkers told me something that made my blood run cold. They found Mike's car parked at a hiking trail about 50 miles away from where we had camped. There was no sign of him, just his car, sitting there like he had driven it himself. That didn't make sense. Mike had left his keys, his phone, and even his boots back at the campsite. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to, but sometimes late at night I think about those footprints. They weren't normal, they were panicked, desperate. Whatever made him run that night, I think it might still be out there, waiting. And I can't help but feel like it's watching me too. I decided to go camping alone to clear my mind. It was late fall, and the forest was really quiet, with only the sound of leaves crunching under my feet. The days were getting shorter, and the nights were coming on fast. I parked my truck by a small open space, set up my tent, and started a fire to stay warm. The sky darkened quickly, and the woods around me felt like they were alive, with something moving in the shadows I couldn't see. At first, I wasn't scared. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons, moving around. The fire felt comforting, and I kept it burning bright as I sat in my camp chair, staring into the flames. After a while, I started feeling tired and crawled into my tent to sleep. The night was colder than I thought it would be, so I zipped myself up tight in my sleeping bag to stay warm. But then, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside my tent. They weren't the usual light steps of an animal. These were heavy, like someone was walking on purpose, like boots crunching on the leaves. My heart started pounding. I didn't move, hoping whoever or whatever it was would just pass by. But the steps stopped right in front of my tent. Then, I heard heavy breathing, slow and steady, like someone was just standing there, listening. I reached for the hunting knife I always keep by my sleeping bag. My hand wrapped tightly around the handle, and I held it close, ready. The breathing continued outside, slow and even. Then, I heard the sound of a zipper being pulled. My tent was being opened. Without thinking, I lunged forward, slashing wildly with my knife. I heard a grunt, followed by a string of loud curses. I scrambled out of the tent, knife still in hand, and saw a man stumbling backward, clutching his arm. He was wearing what looked like hiking clothes, but his face was dirty, his eyes wide with anger. When he saw me holding the knife, his eyes flashed with panic, and he ran off into the woods. My heart was beating so fast I thought I might faint. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward my truck. As I climbed in, I saw a woman walking toward me. She was wearing a police uniform. I thought I was finally safe, that help had arrived. I rolled down the window, and she told me everything was fine, that they were looking for a man who'd been breaking into campsites. She said it was safe for me to stay, but something felt wrong. She didn't have a radio or a weapon, and her uniform didn't look right. Too clean, too plain. I thanked her and decided to stay in my truck for the night, trying to push down the weird feeling in my stomach. When morning came, I packed up quickly and drove straight to the nearest ranger station to report what happened. The ranger listened carefully, his face getting serious as I described the woman. After I finished, he shook his head and told me no female officers were working that night, and definitely not in that area. That's when I realized the truth. Whoever that woman was, she wasn't there to help. She had no reason to let me go if she was really working with the man. But she did. She let me live. Why? I didn't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something much darker than I wanted to believe. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel the same. Now, every time I go near a forest or a park, I get that chill down my spine. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. They aren't the sounds of animals. They're the deliberate steps of someone walking close, just outside of sight. I've always loved camping, especially with my dog, Max. We'd been on plenty of trips together, just us, the woods, and the calm. But this time was different. I picked a spot far from any hiking trails, deep in the forest. It was the kind of place where you only go if you really want to be alone. Setting up camp was easy. Max ran around, sniffing every tree, while I set up the tent and gathered some firewood. As the sun set behind the trees, I lit the fire, and Max curled up beside me. At first, everything felt normal, but then there was something strange. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No sounds from animals, no wind rustling through the leaves. Felt like the whole forest had gone still. I thought maybe it was just the night coming in, but Max didn't like it. He was uneasy, his ears up and his eyes fixed on the dark beyond the firelight. I didn't think much of it. Max was a dog. They get nervous sometimes, right? Then it happened. I heard something in the woods. A crackle, then the snap of a twig. It was too close. My heart raced, and I stood up, straining to listen. Max let out a low bark, a warning, and I realized he wasn't just scared. He was alert. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, only shadows. Max got up and started growling, his fur standing on end. My hand tightened around the flashlight. Something or someone was out there. The rustling grew louder, moving in closer. Then, between the trees, I saw something. A shape, tall, dark, and fast. Slipped from behind one tree to the next. My heart stopped. There was no animal that big in these woods. Max barked wildly, his teeth showing. The shape froze for a moment, and I could hear footsteps, slow and careful. Someone was circling the camp. A chill ran down my back. I grabbed the knife I kept in my bag. It was all I had. The footsteps were getting closer. I moved towards the tent, trying to stay quiet, my breathing sharp. I could feel Max's anxiety, his body trembling. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop growling. Suddenly, the figure stepped into the edge of the firelight. I barely had time to react before Max lunged. The person, or whatever it was, tried to back up, but Max was on him, biting and snarling, pushing him backward. It happened so fast, I couldn't keep up with it. I didn't stop to see what happened next. I just ran. Max was right behind me, pulling me along as I sprinted through the trees. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt like I was running for my life. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. We ran for what felt like hours. My legs were burning, and my chest felt tight, but I couldn't slow down. Finally, we broke into a clearing. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, and Max sat next to me, still alert, but no longer barking. The forest around us was silent again. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The footsteps had stopped. We didn't go back to camp that night. I found the nearest road and called for help. It was a long night. Max and I sat there, waiting, while the darkness pressed in around us. I kept expecting to hear footsteps again, but it never came. When help finally arrived, they told me there was nothing they could find. No sign of anyone, no one in the woods. I knew what I heard, what Max heard. We'd both felt it. Someone had been out there watching us. I never camped in those woods again. Max and I found other spots, but I never felt safe in the woods the same way again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching us now. Sometimes I still think about that night. The way the trees stood still, the way the air felt wrong, like something was waiting. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the rustling. The footsteps that didn't stop until they were too close. Max's hair still stands up sometimes when we're out on a walk, and I wonder if he remembers that night too. I've heard that some things never leave you. Some dangers in the woods don't go away. They just wait, hidden in the dark, until they decide to come closer again.